Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at the #1 GPU on the Steam Hardware Survey. It's been on there for a while, and this is according to August. It is still up there, and that is the RTX 3060, and we're going to compare that against the RTX 2060 Super, which is on the list as well. It's still a fairly popular GPU. It's down around the 15th spot, excluding the mobile GPUs and integrated graphics. It's at about the 15th spot when it comes to dedicated graphics. Yeah, it's got to be embarrassing for AMD, where there is, wow, like the first one, it is way down there. The first time you see a dedicated graphics card, it is the RX 580, and that's probably a good 25 or probably about 25 spots down. Other than that, we have some integrated graphics from AMD. Ugh. Anyway, back to talking about the RTX 3060 and the 2060 Super. Now, before we go any further, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment down below. And we are going to be looking at essentially some of the newer games. I'm really not going to be testing this against something like Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Those are high for video cards like that. You're going to get fairly high FPS. I'm more concerned about current gen AAA titles, which you're going to get now, and possibly what kind of give you an idea of what you can expect to get in the future with these GPUs. So we'll be testing that in native, ray tracing, and with DLSS. Now, neither one of these are current gen cards. The 3060 came out a couple of years ago in 2021, and then a couple of years before that, the 2060 Super came out in mid-2019. They both take about the same power. They're 175, 170 watt cards. The 3060 has additional CUDA cores, about 60 or so, 75, probably about 75% more cores than the 2060 Super. They are clocked a little bit lower, but they do boost slightly higher. And with more cores, we also have additional transistor count, and it also has the updated manufacturing technology. So it's 8 nanometer versus 12 nanometer. Sorry if I'm clearing my throat a lot. My kids are sick, and then they gave it to me. It seems to be a recurring theme in my house where I'm sick at least once a month. So the interface, either one of them really won't be an issue, even though the 3060 is on PCIe Gen 4. That's not going to make much of a difference because the 3060 wouldn't even be able to fill the bandwidth on a PCIe 3 Gen 3 X16. The only time you're going to get some kind of issue is if the card you're using is only using 8 lanes. That can cause problems, but these are able to use the full 16 lanes, so bandwidth is not an issue. They both have GDDR6 RAM, VRAM. The 3060 has 12 gigabytes, where the 2060 Super has only 8 gigabytes. However, you know, NVIDIA doing NVIDIA things, they are kind of handicapping the bus width. So instead of having 8 32-bit lanes for 256-bit total, we only get 6 32-bit lanes. So they're doubling up the RAM per bit lane, which unfortunately is going to narrow down the bandwidth. So the 2060 Super actually has a higher bandwidth, even though it has less memory at 448 gigabits per second, and the 3060 has 360 gigabits per second, which is lower. So that can cause potentially some issue and bottlenecking the performance of the GPU because the memory just doesn't have as much bandwidth. So let's get in, and we are going to start off with Avatar. With Avatar, we're going to have everything set to high or very high settings. There won't be DLSS on, or I don't know if this game actually has ray tracing or not. So starting off, as you can see out of the gate, the 3060 does perform a little bit better. Nothing spectacular. We're only picking up an extra 4 FPS on the average. So we're averaging 32 FPS on the 3060, whereas the 2060 Super is averaging 28. We are picking up a good amount more, though, on the 1% low. We're at 27 versus the 20. Now, this is the built-in benchmark. There's 3 different scenes, so I just restart MSI Afterburner after every scene. And as you can see, we are picking up a bit more FPS here, especially at the 1% low, 32 versus 19. And this is the last scene in the benchmark. And again, we are picking up, on the average, a few extra FPS over the 2060 Super. And for the 1% low, we were picking up a few there as well. So the 3060 is able to perform much better. Well, not much better. In certain scenarios, it is able to perform quite a bit better than the 2060 Super. Now we're going to go and turn DLSS on with the quality setting and rerun the internal benchmark. So again, we're only seeing the 3060 pick up a couple extra FPS in this scene. The 1% low is actually closed the gap, so we're only picking up a couple FPS here on the 1% low. It's definitely taking advantage of the extra 12 or the full 12 gigabytes of VRAM on the 3060 versus the 8 gigabytes on the 2060 Super. So in this scene, the 2060 Super kind of started out a little rocky. We're not doing very good with the 1% low. It is jumping up a little bit, but 3060 is doing much better, and on the average as well is doing much better than the 2060 Super. Now on the last scene, the 3060 again picking up quite a bit for the average and the 1% low. An extra 13 FPS on average and an extra 13 FPS on the 1% low. So based on what we're seeing right here with Avatar, which came out earlier this year, so it is a very new game, the 3060 is much better equipped. You have to use DLSS, of course, but you're much better equipped to get the an average of 60 FPS. Even looking at the frame time graph, it's quite a bit smoother, so you're not going to end up with any kind of, not as much stuttering as you would on the 2060 Super. What seems to be the biggest problem is that the 2060 Super, and I'm assuming this is probably coming down to the RAM issue, is that we are having quite a bit lower 1% low performance, and that is what's causing all the spiking. So 8 gigabytes really isn't enough for current gen games. You just looking off of Avatar, 12 gigabytes is kind of the sweet spot that you want for 1080p gaming on current gen AAA games. If you looked back in some of the other scenes, it was hitting near that 12 gigabyte mark. And here again, we're going to turn DLSS off. And we are going to set all the settings to ultra, and ray tracing is turned off as well. Again, using internal, the built-in gaming benchmark, just because it's easier to compare apples to apples using the built-in gaming benchmark, because there's not as much fluctuation in performance than when you're comparing scenes that are actually in the game. So starting off, we are seeing a pickup on, again, the 3060. It's nearing that 8 gigabytes of VRAM usage on the 3060 side. 2060 Super is only using about 7 gigabytes. And we are pulling up about 10% better, which is pretty impressive. This is still a demanding game. And without DLSS on, we are getting on both cards 60 FPS or higher average. And even the 1% low is still pretty high at 47 for the 2060 Super and 52 on the 3060. And looking at that frame time graph, both are fairly smooth. Okay, now we're going to turn a ray tracing on, and this is where we're probably going to see quite a bit of a hiccup. So the 3060, again with the extra VRAM, is able to operate a little bit more smoothly. We're getting close to 30 FPS average, and the 1% low is 24. And if you look at the frame time graph, it's relatively smooth. However, moving over to the 2060 Super, it is struggling to even hit 15 FPS, and the 1% low is at 11. And you can see that frame time graph kind of going all over the place. So again, 8 gigabytes, not enough VRAM. All right, now we're going to turn DLSS on with quality settings, and we're turning ray tracing back off. So with DLSS, we are picking up a couple extra FPS in both cards. So the 3060 is jumping up to an average of 75 FPS, whereas the 2060 Super is at 68 FPS. And the 1% low is 68 for the 360 versus 60 for the RTX 2060 Super. So both are performing fairly well with DLSS turned on, and the frame time graph is relatively smooth on both cards. Again, the RTX 3060 is able to utilize the additional VRAM, and it's not going as high as with ray tracing on, but we are going over the 8 gigabyte mark, whereas the 2060 Super is using close to 7 gigs. And now for the moment of truth, turning ray tracing on with DLSS. And again, the 2060 Super is struggling with ray tracing. It's taking a pretty large performance hit. Looking at the RTX 3060, it's getting about 50% more FPS on average, and the 1% low is almost triple the performance. So the 2060 Super is struggling quite hard with ray tracing. As you can see on that frame time graph, it is all over the place. However, when it comes to native resolution or with DLSS, no ray tracing, they are both fairly comparable cards, but the 3060 definitely performs better when it comes to ray tracing. And again, a lot of that probably boils down to VRAM and just better ray tracing hardware. All right, off to Hogwarts Legacy. So no DLSS, and ray tracing is going to be turned off with ultra settings across the board. So starting off, we're getting about 75 average FPS on the 3060 versus 60 on the 2060 Super. And as you can see, a lot of that's probably coming down to, again, VRAM. We're using over 10 gigabytes of VRAM on the 3060, whereas on the 2060 Super, we're only hitting around just shy of the 8 gigabyte mark. Then with the 1% low, yeah, we're getting about 50% more FPS with the 3060 versus the 2060 Super. So it's always good to look at that frame time graph because it's substantially smoother on the 3060 versus the 2060 Super. Now, going and turning ray tracing on, this is going to hurt. So both frame time graphs are all over the place. However, the 3060 is not struggling as much as the 2060 Super. We have an average of 36 FPS, which isn't too much higher than the 2060. However, that 1% low is what really is going to make or break how well you enjoy playing at this, because it's actually picking up quite a bit here now. We're getting to 16 FPS, where the 3060 is at 20. So fairly comparable. 2060 Super is picking up performance on that 1% low. But honestly, I would probably not play either of these cards with this game, ray tracing on with no DLSS enabled. So now with ray tracing on, we're also going to turn DLSS on. And surprisingly, both are fairly comparable. So we're averaging 47 FPS on the 3060 and 43 FPS on the 2060 Super. And the 1% low is 28 on the 3060 with 23 on the 2060 Super. So both are looking fairly comparable. So it's just to show you that in some situations, both these cards are quite comparable. They're not materially different, as you can see with the average and 1% low FPS. Now we're moving on to Immortals of Aveum. We're going to go with Ultra settings. And again, we're seeing fairly comparable results. We have 39 average FPS for the 3060 versus 39 for the 2060 Super. And then when you're looking at 1% low, it's 29 FPS on the 3060 versus 2070. Now we're turning DLSS on, and this is actually bumping the performance up a little bit in favor of the 3060. So we're getting an average of 60 FPS on the 3060 versus 46 on the 2060 Super. And where it really matters though is that 1% low, and we are getting a 45 1% low on the 3060 versus 34 on the 2060 Super. So just keeping an eye on that frame time graph. The 3060 is a little bit smoother. Now we're moving on to Jedi Survivor. We have epic settings, DLSS off, and ray tracing off. So far, the average FPS is 30 on the 3060 is 46 versus 40 FPS on the 2060 Super, so it is performing a little bit better. And the 1% low is 34 for the 3060 versus 29 for the 2060 Super. So the 3060 isn't doing a lot better than the 2060 Super, but it is doing a bit better across the board. Looking at that frame time graph, yeah, the 3060 has a few spikes, but not nearly as bad as the 2060 Super. Now we're going to turn DLSS on with the quality preset. And it looks like the advantage of the 3060 head is kind of being trimmed away a little bit. It's now getting an average of 69 FPS versus 60 on the 2060 Super, and the 3060 has a 1% low of 47 versus 42 on the 2060 Super. So it's starting to look like the 3060 is, well, the frame time graph is a lot smoother on the 3060 versus that 2060 Super. All right, now we're moving on to Starfield with DLSS turned off and settings set to Ultra. And the 3060 is doing a little bit better than 2060 Super. We're not by a huge margin though. We're seeing a 35 FPS on average versus 30 on the 2060 Super, and then the 1% low is at 28 versus 23 on the 2060 Super. Again, looking at that frame time graph, 3060 is a little bit smoother, where we're seeing some spiking happening on the 2060 Super, but overall it's not looking too bad. Now we're going to go turn DLSS on with the quality preset. And we're starting to see that frame time graph smooth out a little bit on the 2060 Super. We are getting a 41 average FPS on the 3060 versus 34 on the 2060 Super. And right now, the 1% low is pretty comparable on both GPUs. And coincidentally, neither one of them with DLSS turned on is using over 8 gigabytes of VRAM.
My mother wanted me to be a doctor.
The 3060 is continuing to hold its lead with the average FPS, but really it's not breaking away much on the 1% low. And both of them are seeing a little bit of spikes on the frame time graph, which for the most part though is pretty smooth. So we are going to go with the newest game that has come out that I have, and that is Black Myth Wukong. We've set the graphics preset to cinematic, and we have DLSS. It is showing that it's on, but it actually isn't because we're setting the resolution to 100%. So there is no upscaling at this moment. Now getting into it, the 3060 is performing quite a bit better with native resolution, no DLSS. It is getting an average of 32 FPS with a 1% low of 28, whereas the 2060 Super is got an average of 19 with a 1% low of 14. So not exactly a great performance from the 2060 Super. So at 1080p, the 2060 Super is, yeah, you wouldn't be able to play this game. Whereas with 3060, you could still get by because it is roughly around the 30 FPS, and the 1% low is not that far below it at 25. So both are relatively decent, considering the GPU came out 3 years ago. So after letting the benchmark run for a while, the 3060 is still averaging close to 30 FPS and a 1% low of 25. And on the flip side, the 2060 Super hasn't really picked up in its performance. It only has an average of 16 with a 1% low of 13, which that is not a playable FPS. You could get by with the 3060. It's getting that roughly 30 FPS with not a very big drop on the 1% low, but the 2060 Super is not the greatest. So turn the super resolution down to 80, so it has a little bit of an upscale. We'll go in and rerun the benchmark. Now you could definitely turn that resolution scaling down, so it has to upscale from a lot more from a lower resolution. But at this point it does from 80%. Is 3060 is averaging 35 FPS versus 30 for the 1% low, so there's not a big change from what we saw earlier. And the 2060 Super is actually picking up a little bit more compared to what the 3060 did. So we're now at an average of 22, 23 FPS with a 1% low of 18. Still not a great performance, but you could easily turn the DLSS down to 60% or 50% and have a much greater upscale. The picture won't look as good, but you will have better performance. So compared to the games that we've just seen, there's some games where the 2060 Super and the 3060 are fairly comparable, but there's other games where there is quite a large discrepancy between the two. Honestly, I believe that's coming down to the additional VRAM that comes with 3060. And then when you're looking at ray tracing, well, the 3060 is going to have newer ray tracing hardware, so it is going to be able to perform better than the 2060 Super. and also mixed in with the additional VRAM, the 3060 on paper and when you actually put it into practice, does perform better with ray tracing. However, with both of them, you need to have DLSS enabled to get any kind of playable performance out of it. You can't just run the 3060 native with ray tracing on, unfortunately. But in the grand scheme of things, the amount that you do pay for these cards, considering how much you would have paid, especially back then for a 3060, you would expect much better performance, but we're just not there yet. They're still scraping by with giving gamers fairly low end hardware for the money that you're paying. Look at the 4060, it does not perform much better than a 3060, if at all, and it still has 8 gigabytes of VRAM. I don't know why NVIDIA and AMD both continue to do this, but the 8 gigabytes is just not enough. Anyway, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below, and I'll see you next time.